Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 5.21, Meet the Cabinet. For the last 3 episodes, we have spent our time looking at the establishment of the new government. In many cases, this involved the branches clashing as they carved out their own places in the new system. If the Constitution was a framework for the government, the application of that system would be formed through the often contentious battles between the branches. Now, at the rate that we are going through the narrative, it is going to take me like 10,000 episodes to get to the end of this podcast. However, I do promise that in the near future, we are going to start marching through events again at the more common rate that we have become accustomed to here. Before we do that, though, I've got this last episode planned to look at the formation of the new government. Last time we had talked about the creation of those new executive departments, specifically Foreign Affairs, which would soon become known as the Department of State, and the Treasury. These departments were used as our examples. However, as we are going to see today, they would not be alone. What I would like to do today is to look at the members of Washington's first cabinet and explore exactly who they were and what they would bring to the table. These men would help define the executive branch along with Washington, and would have a profound effect on the future of the country. In order to do this, I'm going to take them on each individually and look at what each person brought to that first administration. Before we can jump in and just start looking at the original 4 cabinet members, I want to start today by looking at the idea of a cabinet as a whole. The body was itself controversial, yet it seemed almost inevitable that it would have to be formed. The original cabinet was made up of 4 men. You had Alexander Hamilton at Treasury, Jefferson running the State Department, Henry Knox as the Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as the Attorney General. It is interesting to note that the first official cabinet meeting did not occur until November 26, 1791, which, if you're counting, is past the halfway mark of Washington's first term. This begs the further question of exactly why it took so long for the first meeting of the cabinet to take place, considering what a vital institution it would later become. To begin, though, I want to consider what the purpose of the cabinet is. The idea of a cabinet is nothing that is unique to the United States. We talked about in our last episode the very deep distrust that existed in the United States towards the British cabinet and how it functioned. In Britain, the cabinet stood at the very center of the government. Since the end of the Glorious Revolution, the monarch's power had been in decline, with the cabinet largely existing as that top-level executive leadership. When the imperial crisis came during the 1760s and 70s, so much of that anger that Americans had towards the British had been towards the Parliament, and more specifically, towards the British cabinet. They were the ones calling the shots that were so deeply despised by the Americans. If the cabinet had been the ones leading the British, and, thus in the eyes of the Americans, leading everything so astray that it ultimately necessitated a full separation from the mother country, it should come as little surprise that Americans looked at the role of a cabinet as rife with the risk of corruption. It is worth noting that Washington himself was absolutely aware of the general feelings towards the idea of a cabinet, considering that he was very careful during his own presidency to avoid actually using that term. Per historian Lindsay Chervinsky, by the end of 1793, the term cabinet was in regular use throughout the country, both in the press and by members of Congress. Washington, however, always avoided using the term, often instead referring to these meetings as meetings of the secretaries, more of meetings of the gentlemen of my family, the latter clearly a reference to Washington's military family from back during the war. Throughout his entire 2 terms, Washington steadfastly avoided the term, although as soon as John Adams took over the top job, Washington quickly dropped all pretense and happily referred to Adams' cabinet. Yet, despite the population's distrust for the body, the way that Washington viewed leadership made the existence of a cabinet seem almost inevitable. Consider Washington's background when it comes to leadership. Sure, he had spent a bit of time in the Virginia House of Burgesses. However, he was never exactly a leading member of that body. Nobody here is confusing George Washington for Patrick Henry. Even during the Constitutional Convention, Washington's role as president of that assembly largely had him limited to making sure that everybody stayed on track. He was certainly not the driving force that somebody like Madison or James Wilson was. In fact, Washington's biggest role at the Constitutional Convention was just actually being at the Constitutional Convention. His participation helped lend the convention much-needed legitimacy. Of course, none of this is to suggest somehow that Washington lacked in the leadership department. Rather, his leadership abilities had been forged during the Revolution. Considering the impact that had on him, it seems logical that he would take those lessons and adapt them to his new office. In this way, the cabinet for Washington would become something that existed out of pragmatism. When Washington called that first meeting of the cabinet, it came during a period where there was significant strife that he was having to deal with. Now, all of these things are going to be topics that we discuss down the road. But by the time of the first meeting in 1791, Washington was dealing with both ongoing uprisings out in western Pennsylvania, as well as a geopolitical headache when it came to the relationship between the United States and the European powers. Convening the cabinet allowed Washington to call upon a team of advisors that he not only knew, but that he had personally selected. In this way, the cabinet would function for the Washington presidency much as his councils of war had back during the Revolution. As with the war councils, the cabinet provided Washington with a body that could bring him a variety of viewpoints, giving him the information that he believed to be necessary to make the hard decisions. Recall back to just a moment ago when I mentioned that Washington would occasionally refer to the cabinet meetings as meetings of the gentlemen of his family. A very clear nod to the idea of the military family, which had served with him during the war. Washington had, back in August 1789, tried to enlist the Senate in that role of providing him with advice, something that we talked about at length last time. Now, if you'll recall, the Senate had exactly zero interest in existing as Washington's personal advisor. And sure enough, it was something that Washington himself had little interest in replaying. The cabinet therefore provided Washington with a close group of advisors whom he himself trusted. When forming the cabinet, Washington himself had a couple of critical decisions to make. As historians Stanley Elkins and Eric McKittrick explain, Washington had a few different options when it came to choosing those secretaries. Back across the Atlantic and some 70 years earlier, it was Robert Walpole, who found himself in much the same situation. Following the Glorious Revolution, the government inside of England had suffered through paroxysms of instability as various Whig and Tory factions battled it out for control. To get control over this, Walpole had created a system of patronage, a system whereby money and loyalty translated directly into political power. This system had done much to usher in stability within the English court. Those who met the necessary prerequisites and proved adequately loyal were given the choice jobs in the government, with some of the most prominent positions being inside the English cabinet. In essence, this would create a governing class inside of England. The problem with this system is that although it does create political stability by locking people and families into prominent places in the government, it also had the consequence of forming a new group of outsiders who existed on the fringes. Those were the people who were inevitably left out in the cold, which, consequently, leads to all the bitterness and anger that one might imagine. So enter the American colonies, who had suffered at the hands of so many of these men who had reached their stations as a direct result of patronage. Everybody from the customs officials to the royal governors and ultimately the cabinet members, who had done so much to alienate and infuriate the American colonists, owed their jobs to that very patronage system. Can you guess who was on the outside of that system, sitting there looking in and growing more and more frustrated every single day? If you guessed the American colonists, Well, gold star for you. We, of course, know that story, and I think it is at least understandable why this system of patronage was so powerfully distrusted by those now living in the United States. As much as Washington understood the distrust for this type of a system, it was hard to deny that it did provide certain benefits. The United States was a country that was in desperate need for stability, and, well, the Walpole patronage system offered him exactly that thing. The other option for Washington was a system based wholly on merit. This requires far less explanation. It is simply a system where the best guy gets the job. Now, on paper, this logically sounds like a much better system. Why wouldn't we want to give the best person in the room the gig? The problem here, however, is that Washington realized that these appointments had to fill a greater purpose as well. He fully understood that it was necessary to bind loyalty to himself and his government. Those, therefore, that found themselves in positions of power inside of Washington's government often became men whom he referred to as having first character. The men he chose were not necessarily from the leading families, although there certainly was a large amount of overlap, but rather the men that he sought out were generally local leaders. Men who had proven themselves and had gained the trust of their local communities. Far from creating an American aristocracy, Washington's overarching goal was to help bind the regions and communities to the new government by placing people into positions of power that were trusted at a local level. This is a precedent that the majority of future presidents would follow, using the power of the cabinet to help tie the country together. Think of the men in Washington's first cabinet. You had Jefferson and Randolph, who, like Washington, were both Virginians. At the same time, however, you've got Hamilton from New York and Henry Knox from Massachusetts. As the presidency evolves, what it means to tie the country together will likewise change with the times. However, this would remain a key part of the cabinet's utility. These appointments would extend well beyond just the cabinet as well, and indeed would very much paint just how Washington would assemble his new government from the top down. During those first months, Washington made a staggering 350 or so appointments, always carefully choosing men who had found themselves well respected within their own communities. With the cabinet, there were only 3 states represented. However, all regions were accounted for, with Massachusetts covering New England, New York handling the middle states, and the 2 Virginia appointees giving coverage to the South. When you extend this out even further and look at the makeup of the first Supreme Court, things become even more geographically diverse, with 6 states being represented on the highest court. What Washington was able to do via his appointments here was to build a wide coalition of men loyal to the new government. These positions were largely based on merit, but specifically were designed to be a geographically diverse group of men who were highly respected within their communities. This would in turn help bind those communities closer to the central government. For the citizens in that group who knew little to nothing about the new government, what they did know is that the most respected man in their local community had received an appointment. So, hey, it can't be that bad, right? Evolution of the cabinet aside, I want to pivot over now towards looking specifically at the men who are going to form Washington's initial cabinet. Much like Washington himself, they are going to help define their positions and often set precedents that will help explain the growth of these critical government departments. As the new administration settled in, the biggest problem facing them remained the financial catastrophe that they were currently engaged in. No single thing had been more influential in bringing down the Confederation as was the economic chaos that had gripped the country. To say that the United States was flat broke during the 1780s was an understatement. Even had the government wanted to be more energetic, they completely lacked the ability to pay for more meaningful measures. We are going to talk about Henry Knox in a bit, so this topic will come back up. But recall that back during Shays' Rebellion, Knox found the government completely impotent in its response because they had no available funds to respond. Instead, you had the Boston merchants paying for Benjamin Lincoln to lead what amounted to a private army into western Massachusetts to put down the rebels. Although it worked and the rebels were indeed scattered, it is hardly the look that any government wants to project. As important as this position was, Washington understood that running Treasury was going to be fraught with danger. Whomever was going to fill the position was going to need to be energetic enough to deal with what remained the biggest threat facing the new government, yet politically savvy enough to take controversial bills and work them through Congress. When it came to the world of finance, those in both houses of Congress were liable to be prickly. Despite the monumental task of running what was presently the most important department, Washington seems to have had little hesitation of who to put in the driver's seat. For this all-important role, Washington turned to Alexander Hamilton. Now, that Washington would want Hamilton in his administration is far from a surprise. Back during the Revolution, Hamilton had spent much of his time, often much to his own consternation, as Washington's right-hand man. Hamilton, being a talented writer, spent much of his time during the war handling Washington's always considerable amount of correspondence. Hamilton was a man who was always seeking any kind of upward mobility that he might clutch onto, and he had not personally wanted to spend the entire war writing letters. For his part, Hamilton wanted some of that battlefield glory. I mean, he has this entire war going on around him, and he sees opportunities for glory all over the place, so why shouldn't some of it come to him? By 1781, the relationship between the men, although still functional, had become somewhat strained, as Hamilton grew increasingly tired of working as an aide. This would all end up blowing up when, in March of that year, Washington summoned Hamilton, who was at that time busy in conversation with Lafayette. Rather than dropping everything and rushing to Washington, Hamilton went ahead and finished up his conversation before he went over to see what the general needed. Washington, incensed at being forced to wait some 10 minutes for Hamilton, laid into his aide, complaining about what he saw as blatant disrespect. Hamilton, rather than backing down, up and quit Washington's staff. One talent that George Washington really did not have was in his ability to apologize and turn the other cheek. George Washington held grudges, and in fact could hold on to them for a really long time. So you can imagine his feelings when he personally apologized to Hamilton, only for the younger man to blow him off. Finally, it was the wisdom of his father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, who told Hamilton that this was probably not the hill that he wanted to die on. We know that by the time that the Battle of Yorktown came around, their relationship was at least good enough that Hamilton's request for a field command was granted. Following the end of the war, the two men had some more interaction regarding the entire ordeal over pay, which accumulated in the Newburgh conspiracy. But after that, they really had surprisingly limited contact. Alexander Hamilton was nothing if not ambitious, probably to a fault. With the war over and Washington busy reveling in his glory, it seems that Hamilton felt little need to communicate with his old boss. As Washington biographer John Fairling points out, when Hamilton traveled to Maryland for the Annapolis Convention, he didn't even bother to make the trek to Mount Vernon to check in and say hi to Washington. Despite Hamilton and Washington having little in the way of a relationship during the 1780s, at least prior to 1787, Hamilton was nothing if not a devoted Federalist. He was in favor of a stronger national government. During the Revolution, Hamilton had found himself consistently frustrated at the inability of Congress to run the war effort. From this point forward, Hamilton remained a staunch advocate of a stronger executive, to the point that accusations of him being a monarchist were never terribly hard to find. When Shays' Rebellion occurred, Hamilton again found himself frustrated by the complete inability of Congress to do anything at all about the uprising, further strengthening his resolve that a powerful executive was a necessity. Following the Constitutional Convention, where he was uncharacteristically quiet, due in part to him being the outsider in his delegation, Hamilton would join John Jay and James Madison in drafting the Federalist Papers. Indeed, Hamilton would be the primary author of the papers. Following 1787, Hamilton, likely understanding the position his old boss was about to be in, quickly began to move back into Washington's good graces. Now, people absolutely did notice this, and it does seem that at one point Hamilton had to ask Washington to clarify to others that Hamilton was not just sucking up to further his own career. Regardless of these charges, however true they may be, Washington fully understood the immense talents that Hamilton had. Furthermore, Washington trusted him. In a role as critical as the Treasury was in 1789, having both those talents that Hamilton possessed, combined with Washington's deep trust in him, well, the decision was easy, and Washington wasted no time in selecting Hamilton for the role. If getting the nation's finances in order was the primary goal of Washington's, foreign relations were a close second. Recall that one of the biggest things to divide the states ahead of the Constitutional Convention was the question over the navigation rights to the Mississippi. Spain had never acknowledged the sweeping grants given to the Americans in the Treaty of Paris, and now had little interest in allowing them navigation along the Mississippi. This created a crisis as the eastern states thought seriously about selling out the western territories in exchange for favorable trade deals with Spain. This opened up the risk that the western territories might either find themselves falling under Spanish control or leaving the United States in the interest of doing their own thing entirely. As is, the United States lacked the money to actually protect those western territories. The British continued to squat in a handful of strategic outposts, despite the Treaty of Paris saying that it was time for them to leave. Beyond the failure of the government, up to this point, to police its own frontiers, Washington would have also been acutely aware by this point of the dangerous things happening across the ocean in France. 1789 in France saw the calling of the Estates General, the Tennis Court Oath, the storming of the Bastille, and the Women's March on Versailles, which resulted in King Louis XVI relocating to Paris, very much against his will. Although in regard to that last part, the Women's March, Washington may well have been unaware of it when making his nomination. Indeed, as we are going to see, one of the biggest challenges in the coming years for Washington is going to be over the question of European allies and exactly what the role of the United States was going to be. With France now experiencing the first real convulsions of its revolution, it makes sense that Washington would turn to a man who knew France quite well by that point, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had spent the last 4 years in Paris acting as the foreign minister to France. If anybody was going to have an understanding of the crisis presently developing, it was going to be him. Now, surprisingly, Jefferson was not actually the first pick for this office. Rather, Washington had initially looked in John Jay's direction. Jay had been intimately involved with the crisis along the Mississippi River, and was the one who proposed the treaty, ceding the Mississippi to the Spanish. We will never know how that nomination would have been received in the Senate, however, because John Jay was not interested in becoming the Secretary of State. Jay's real desire was a spot on the soon-to-be-formed Supreme Court. Washington granted that request, and in short order, John Jay would become the first Chief Justice of the nation's highest court. As for Thomas Jefferson, he actually had no idea that he was even up for the job of Secretary of State. It was not until he returned to the United States that November that he learned about his new gig. Jefferson's politics existed in something of a weird space. As we are going to see down the road, he took the bounds of the Constitution very seriously, and would display a real unease when it came to expanding the executive. This is somewhat surprising, considering that during his time as the governor of Virginia, he often found those constitutional limitations to be overly restrictive when it came to defending the state. Of course, we know that his time as governor had not exactly gone smoothly. Jefferson would spend much of his career having to answer to charges, at a minimum, of not doing enough to protect Virginia during the war, to the more extreme allegations of him outright abandoning the state. To be clear, none of this is necessarily to suggest that Jefferson was opposed to the idea of a more energetic chief executive. Rather, where he differed from Hamilton, and in time Washington, was in interpreting the limitations on the presidency. As we are going to see in depth over the coming episodes, these differences are going to help define the next decade of politics in the United States and is going to help to shape the interpersonal battles in Washington's first cabinet. As this season moves along, we are going to see Jefferson's own relationship with the power of the executive continue to evolve. In some ways, Henry Knox as the Secretary of War might have been the easiest appointment for Washington. First, Knox was already the Secretary of War under the Confederation. Following that government's collapse, he remained in the position, hamstrung as he was. However, this isn't exactly a case of Washington just sticking with the status quo. Ever since meeting him back in 1775 outside of Boston, Washington had been close with Knox. He had conducted himself well in his command over the artillery, and spent the entire war in Washington's innermost circle. The only other name that I can really think of that Washington might have seriously considered for this position was Nathanael Greene, but he had died a few years earlier. Knox himself had toiled in his role as the Secretary of War under the Confederation, an experience that personally showed him the need for a stronger, more energetic executive. As the Secretary of War, it was Knox's responsibility to deal with Daniel Shays and company when they decided to have their uprising. Of course, as we know from back in episode 5.8, when I say it was Knox's responsibility, I mean that more theoretically than practically. In reality, there was nothing at all that Knox could do. The Confederation was so completely flat broke at this point that it wasn't like he could go out and crush the uprising, as his mandate again theoretically imposed. To say that this was a frustrating situation for Knox would be a profound understatement. This is to say absolutely nothing of the fact that Knox quickly became abundantly aware of how incapable the Congress was at controlling the situation out in the West. From his perspective, Congress had proven itself completely unable to govern, even within its own territory. Now, Knox had a pretty obvious solution to this problem: raise more troops and strengthen the army. Which Congress agreed that, yeah, that would be awesome, but hey, remember, we're flat broke. We, of course, know that Shays' Rebellion was eventually put down by the Boston elites when they essentially offered to pay for a private army, which in turn quickly got events under control. Although Knox does not seem to have held any real animosity towards Benjamin Lincoln, it was not missed on him the implications of the public having to hold a fundraising event in order to pay for an army to suppress a rebellion. It was under these circumstances that Henry Knox found himself advocating for a stronger executive. He had no interest in ever having to sit on the sidelines again and watch helplessly. Knox had been with Washington throughout the entire Revolution as one of the highest-ranked officers. He had remained close with him after the war. Through his own first-hand experience, he had become an advocate for a strong executive. It therefore should be with little surprise that Knox made an easy pick to serve with Washington again, this time as his Secretary of War. To round out the original cabinet, we get to Edmund Randolph. Randolph had been having a bit of a rough go of things since 1787. So let's take a moment to recap the last 2 years of his life. Back in 1787, Randolph was the governor of Virginia when he was selected as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Coming into the convention, as pretty much everybody did, he was a devout nationalist. It was Randolph who would personally introduce James Madison's Virginia Plan. As we detailed, however, by the end of the convention, Randolph had lost faith in the new Constitution and refused to sign it. When, in 1788, the question of ratification was taken up in Virginia, Randolph came into the convention as an anti-federalist. However, here again, Randolph would change his mind. Citing the fact that so many other states had already pulled the trigger and ratified, plus claiming that the idea of a Bill of Rights appeased his concerns. Randolph agreed to vote in favor of ratification. Patrick Henry, who was not at all amused by Randolph's flip-flopping, accused him of changing sides, insinuating that George Washington had promised him a position in the new government, when, of course, Washington inevitably became the first president. In a moment that I imagine featured Patrick Henry shaking his fist and screaming, "I told you so," in frustration, it was indeed Edmund Randolph that Washington selected to be the Attorney General. For Washington, Randolph was not a difficult choice, even in light of any potential deals made for him to switch his vote during the ratification process. Randolph had been close to Washington for years and had long been his own personal attorney. Washington knew Randolph and he trusted the man, both as a personal advisor and as a lawyer. Like our other cabinet members, Randolph had personally seen the need for a strong executive. While the governor of Virginia, he saw just how frustrating a weak executive could be firsthand, when he lacked the ability to fortify the frontiers against dangers from the native tribes. Randolph, it is worth mentioning, would have an upward arc throughout Washington's cabinet. He would spend the first years as the first Attorney General, and would be critical for helping create some of the legal precedents of the new country. After Jefferson retires, Randolph would upgrade to become the second Secretary of State. The people that we have talked about today, of course, make up only a very small percentage of the total number of people that Washington would appoint in 1789. Washington appointed a slate of 6 judges to be included on the newly formed Supreme Court. We have already discussed John Jay, who was to serve as the first Chief Justice. However, in addition to Jay, you had James Wilson of Pennsylvania, John Blair from Virginia, Robert Harrison of Maryland, John Rutledge from South Carolina, and William Cushing of Massachusetts. Harrison, already sick at this point, declined the nomination, and in his place, Jared Iredell of North Carolina took the slot. Notice again here the wide distribution between the different regions of the country. All of the new justices would come from a different state. Yet another example of Washington doing whatever he could to equally spread out the reach of the government in order to help it gain acceptance from the people. With the new government now in place, it was time for everybody to set to the monumental task of trying to claw out from underneath the mess that the Confederation had left for them. Next time, we begin that process of trying to put out the immediate fires and get the United States onto stable footing. This is going to mean addressing the elephant in the room that is the economic conundrum that the country found itself in. At the same time, we are going to begin looking at the prerequisite that so many states had laid out in exchange for ratification, the creation of a federal Bill of Rights. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as the new government gets to work.